My name is Emily Carter, and the moment my father laughed at me in front of 50 people was the exact moment he lost me. "What does a girl know about guns?" he shouted loud enough for everyone at the charity range to hear. "Don't embarrass me." The crowd laughed nervously. I didn't answer. I stepped onto the firing line, picked up the pistol, and took one slow breath. 5 shots echoed across the Kentucky hills. When the target rolled back, there wasn't a cluster of holes. There was only one. 5 rounds had passed through nearly the same opening in the center of the bullseye. The entire range fell silent. Then something happened that nobody, including me, expected. An older man, wearing a faded Navy SEAL Association cap, froze where he stood. His coffee cup slipped from his hand and splashed across the concrete. He stared at me for several long seconds before snapping to attention. Then, in front of everyone, including my father, he rendered me the sharpest military salute I'd received since leaving my last deployment. My father's smile disappeared. His face turned as white as the paper target hanging 50 feet away. That was the day everything changed. But to understand why that salute mattered so much, you have to understand the man my father had always believed I was. I grew up outside Bowling Green, Kentucky, on 20 acres of rolling farmland that had belonged to my grandfather before it belonged to my father. Dad believed in hard work. He believed in discipline. He believed a man's word was his bond. Those were lessons I admired. Unfortunately, he also believed certain jobs belonged to men and others belonged to women. My younger brother Jason learned to hunt before he turned 10. I learned how to bake biscuits with Mom. Jason got his first .22 rifle for Christmas. I got a sewing kit. Whenever I wandered into the garage while Dad was cleaning his hunting rifles, he'd shake his head before I even opened my mouth. "Go help your mother." That became the soundtrack of my childhood. Go help your mother. Go inside. This isn't for girls. As I got older, those words changed. You're smart enough to become a teacher. Nursing would fit you. You'll make some man a wonderful wife someday. Every compliment came with invisible boundaries. Every dream I had seemed too big because I happened to be born a daughter. Ironically, Dad had spent 28 years as a police officer. He trusted women to answer emergency calls. He trusted women to investigate crimes. He simply couldn't imagine one leading soldiers into combat. When I was 17, everything changed. September 11th had already reshaped America. Like millions of other Americans, I watched those towers fall. I watched firefighters run toward danger while everyone else ran away. Something inside me shifted forever. I didn't want an easy life. I wanted a meaningful one. After college, I accepted a commission in the United States Army. When I came home wearing my lieutenant's bars for the first time, Mom cried. Dad barely looked up from the television. "You'll figure out soon enough that the Army isn't made for women." Those words stayed with me through Officer Basic. They stayed with me during Ranger School, where every muscle in my body screamed for me to quit. They stayed with me through freezing rain, blistered feet, and nights without sleep. Every obstacle became fuel. Every doubt became motivation. I wasn't trying to prove women belonged. I was trying to prove that my father had underestimated his own daughter. Years passed. One deployment became 2, then 3. Eventually, I made major. Mom called every time I received another promotion. Dad never did. When I mailed photographs home, Mom displayed them proudly in the hallway. Dad kept calling me the little girl playing soldier. I stopped trying to convince him. It hurt less that way. Then about a month before his 65th birthday, Mom called. Her voice sounded tired. "Emily," she said softly, "would you please come home this once? Your father won't ask, but I'd like all of us together." I almost said no. I'd spent too many holidays sitting across from a man who treated every achievement like a phase I'd eventually outgrow. But Mom had stood beside me every step of my life. If she was asking, I couldn't refuse. So I drove from Fort Campbell back to Kentucky on a warm Saturday morning in early September. The birthday party wasn't held at our farm. Dad had organized something much bigger. The local Veterans of Foreign Wars Post was hosting a charity barbecue and shooting competition to raise money for disabled veterans. In fairness, that part made sense. Despite our differences, Dad cared deeply about veterans. He simply didn't believe his own daughter deserved to be counted among them. The parking lot was already full when I arrived. Pickup trucks lined the gravel entrance. American flags waved beside folding tables covered with homemade pies and barbecue. Older veterans swapped stories beneath large oak trees. Children chased one another across the grass. For a moment, it felt like every small-town gathering I'd known growing up. Mom hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. "You look tired," she whispered. "I've looked worse." She smiled sadly. "I know. Dad finally noticed me walking toward the pavilion. Instead of welcoming me, he looked down at my civilian jeans and polo shirt. "No uniform today?" I shrugged. "This isn't about me." He laughed. "That's probably for the best." The words landed harder than I expected. Still, I refused to argue. People were eating. Families were laughing. Mom deserved one peaceful afternoon. After lunch, the charity shooting contest began. Several retired police officers competed. A few Marine veterans took turns. Some local sheriff's deputies joined in. Then one of Dad's oldest friends noticed me standing beside the fence. "Emily," he called. "Army taught you how to shoot, yet—" The crowd chuckled. Before I could answer, Dad raised his voice. "What does a girl know about guns?" He looked around waiting for agreement. "Don't embarrass me." The laughter this time was louder. I could feel dozens of eyes watching me. Some looked uncomfortable. Others looked curious. I slowly walked toward the firing line. "I'll take one magazine," I said quietly. The range officer handed me a pistol. The steel felt familiar in my hands. The noise around me faded away. There was only my breathing. The front sight. The trigger. 5 controlled presses. 5 clean breaks. 5 perfect shots. When the target returned, conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even the children quit talking. An elderly man wearing a Navy SEAL Association cap stepped closer. His eyes widened. Then recognition replaced surprise. He removed his sunglasses. His posture straightened instinctively. And before anyone understood what was happening, he snapped to attention. The retired Navy SEAL commander held his salute long enough for every conversation on the range to die. I returned it automatically. Old habits never really leave a soldier. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even my father seemed frozen where he stood, his paper plate hanging loosely in one hand. The older man lowered his salute, stepped toward me, and smiled with the kind of respect that can only exist between people who have seen the worst parts of the world. "It's good to see you again, Major Carter." I recognized his voice before I recognized his face. Time had added gray hair and deeper lines around his eyes, but there was no mistaking him. "Captain Jack Morrison," I said. He laughed. "Retired now." We shook hands. His grip was just as firm as I remembered. Around us, people began whispering. Dad looked from Jack to me as though he had stumbled into someone else's conversation. "You two know each other?" one of the local deputies asked. Jack turned toward the crowd. "Know her," he said. "I'd be visiting names carved into granite if I didn't." The whispers stopped. Dad frowned. "I think you've got the wrong person." Jack looked at him politely. "I don't believe I do." "My daughter works in the Army," Dad replied. "Office job mostly." A few people nodded, assuming that explanation made sense. Jack looked back at me and chuckled softly. "You still keeping your accomplishments quiet?" "I've had practice." He smiled knowingly. Then he faced the crowd again. "Ladies and gentlemen, this woman didn't save paperwork." He paused. "She saved people." The range fell completely silent. Jack wasn't a man who enjoyed the spotlight. I remembered that much from years ago. If he was speaking publicly, every word mattered. "It was overseas," he began. "Joint operation, Army and Navy working together." He glanced at me before continuing. "I'm not allowed to discuss everything that happened, and I never will." Several veterans nodded in understanding. "But I can tell you this. There were 12 of us. We walked into an ambush." Nobody interrupted him. "You don't forget the sound of bullets hitting vehicles. You don't forget the silence on the radio when communication goes down. And you definitely don't forget the officer who refuses to leave until every last American is accounted for." His eyes settled on me. That officer was Major Emily Carter. I shifted uncomfortably. Praise had always made me uneasy. Jack noticed. "She's doing it again," he said with a grin. "What?" "Trying to disappear." A few people laughed gently. Dad didn't. He crossed his arms. "With all due respect," he said, "Emily's always exaggerated things." My stomach tightened. Mom quietly touched Dad's arm. "Frank." He ignored her. "I'm sure she served honorably." Jack's expression remained calm. "But combat leadership?" He shook his head. "I've known my daughter her entire life. I think I'd know." Jack didn't raise his voice. In fact, he spoke even more quietly. "Sir, I've trusted her with mine." That sentence landed harder than any argument ever could. Several older veterans exchanged glances. They understood exactly what he meant. Trust wasn't given lightly in combat. It was earned one decision at a time. Dad looked around, searching for someone to agree with him. Nobody did. Jack reached into his jacket pocket. "I usually don't carry this around." He unfolded a worn photograph. "There we are." He handed it to Dad. The picture had been taken years earlier. Dust covered everything. Half our uniforms were torn. Every face looked exhausted. But there we stood. Army, Navy, Air Force. Together. Dad stared at the photograph. His eyes found mine almost immediately. Then the combat patch on my shoulder. Then the bronze star pinned to my chest. He looked up slowly. When was this taken? About 11 years ago. Dad frowned. Emily never told us. I wasn't allowed to. That much was true. Many deployments remained classified for years. Some details never became public. Jack folded his arms. Your daughter never bragged. She never asked for recognition. Frankly, getting her to accept an award was harder than getting her into a helicopter. A few veterans laughed. I rolled my eyes. You promised never to tell that story. I lied. The tension eased slightly. Only slightly. Dad still looked unconvinced. I don't understand. What don't you understand? Jack asked. How someone like Dad hesitated. Emily could end up leading experienced operators. Jack's smile faded. Because leadership isn't about who talks the loudest. It's about who stays calm when everyone else is scared. His words carried the quiet authority of experience. I watched her make impossible decisions. I watched her refuse evacuation until every wounded soldier had been loaded first. I watched her walk back into danger because 2 men hadn't answered roll call. Jack looked directly at my father. I've met bigger men. I've never met a braver officer. I wish the ground would open beneath me. Compliments from fellow soldiers meant more than medals. But hearing them in front of my father felt almost painful. Because they were arriving 20 years too late. Mom wiped tears from her eyes. She wasn't crying because Jack praised me. She was crying because someone else had finally said everything she'd wanted my father to hear. Dad handed the photograph back. He stopped. Words had never failed him before. Now they did. I need some air. Without waiting for anyone to answer, he walked away from the range. His shoulders looked smaller than I had ever seen them. Mom watched him disappear toward the parking lot. I'm sorry, she whispered. You don't have anything to apologize for. She sighed. I kept hoping he'd change. I know. Jack stood quietly beside me. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally he asked, You okay? I smiled. I've been shot at. That wasn't my question. Leave it to a SEAL to see through every mask. I don't know, I admitted. I spent years imagining what this moment would feel like. And it doesn't feel like revenge, he nodded. It never does. We walked toward the picnic tables where volunteers were serving peach cobbler. Families had already started talking again, though every few seconds someone glanced my way. Not with curiosity anymore. With respect. An elderly Marine approached first. Then a Vietnam veteran. Then a Gold Star mother whose son had served overseas. Each thanked me quietly. Each handshake felt heavier than the last. None of them knew the details. They simply recognized service. That was enough. As the afternoon wound down, Jack handed me a cream-colored envelope. I almost forgot. What's this? He smiled. An invitation. I opened it carefully. Across the top were the words, National Veterans Leadership Conference, Arlington, Virginia. I looked up. They want me to speak. They specifically requested you. I don't give speeches. You tell the truth. That's better. I laughed softly. I'll think about it. Jack shook his head. No, you'll come. Because there are people there who need to hear your story. Before I could answer, I noticed my father standing alone beside his pickup truck across the parking lot. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the old photograph still clutched tightly in his hands. For the first time in my life, he looked like a man questioning everything he thought he knew about his own daughter. I spent the next 2 weeks trying to convince myself I didn't need to go to Virginia. Speaking in front of a room full of veterans, senior officers, and military families sounded far more intimidating than any field exercise I'd ever completed. In the Army, everyone had a mission. Everyone knew their role. Standing behind a podium with hundreds of eyes fixed on me felt entirely different. I almost called Captain Jack Morrison to decline the invitation 3 separate times. Each time I hung up before the call connected. Finally, my mother settled the matter. You've spent your whole life speaking for soldiers who couldn't come home, she said over the phone one evening. Now it's your turn to let people hear your own voice. She was right. 3 days later, I boarded a flight from Nashville to Reagan National Airport. Whenever I flew into Washington, D.C., I felt 2 different emotions at once, pride and grief. Every deployment eventually passed through this city. Every military funeral somehow led back here. Some of my closest friends had names carved into white marble because of decisions made in buildings only a few miles away. The conference was being held at a hotel in Arlington, just across the Potomac River. The ballroom overlooked the Pentagon in the distance. Veterans from every branch filled the lobby. Some walked with canes. Others wore prosthetic legs. Several still carried themselves with the unmistakable posture that never truly leaves military people no matter how many years pass. The average age in the room had to be well over 60. Many wore small pins on their lapels representing Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraq, or Afghanistan. No one cared about rank anymore. Only service. Jack spotted me almost immediately. "There she is," he called. He introduced me to retired Marines, Air Force pilots, Coast Guard rescue swimmers, Army medics, and Gold Star families. Nobody asked how many medals I had. Nobody cared. Instead, they asked questions that only veterans ask. Where were you stationed? What unit? How are your knees holding up? That last one made everyone laugh. Military knees have a reputation. By lunchtime, I felt less like a guest and more like family. That afternoon, the organizers hosted a panel discussion about leadership under pressure. One retired 4-star general spoke first. A Navy corpsman followed. Then they handed me the microphone. I looked around the room. Hundreds of faces waited quietly. I took a deep breath. When people thanked me for my service, I always tell them the same thing. I wasn't alone. If you remember nothing else today, remember that no soldier succeeds by themselves. Heads nodded throughout the audience. I talked about trust. About ordinary people doing extraordinary things because someone beside them depended on them. I never described classified missions. Instead, I described friendships. I spoke about a young medic from Ohio who sang country songs whenever helicopters landed because he was terrified of flying. I told them about a supply sergeant from Texas who somehow found birthday cakes in places where nothing should have existed except sand. I described a quiet communications specialist from Oregon who mailed handwritten letters to the families of wounded soldiers every single Sunday. War wasn't only firefights. It was people. The room stayed remarkably still. When I finished, nobody applauded immediately. For several long seconds, there was only silence. Then one elderly Vietnam veteran slowly stood. He began clapping. Another veteran stood beside him. Then another. Within moments, the entire ballroom rose to its feet. The standing ovation lasted longer than my speech. I wished it would end. Not because I wasn't grateful. Because I knew countless men and women deserved to be standing beside me. Afterward, dozens of people came forward to shake my hand. One woman held my hands in both of hers. "My husband never talked about Vietnam," she said quietly. "But today," she smiled through tears, "today I think I finally understood why." Moments like that reminded me why stories mattered. Not because they celebrated individuals, because they helped families understand sacrifices that words often failed to explain. Late that evening, I walked alone through Arlington National Cemetery. I've always believed every American should visit at least once. The endless rows of white headstones don't glorify war. They remind us of its cost. I stopped beside the grave of Captain Michael Reyes. Mike had been one of the finest officers I'd ever known. He had 2 young daughters when he was killed. I knelt, brushed a few leaves away from the stone, and smiled. "Your girls are both in college now," I said softly. "I think you'd be proud." The breeze rustled through the old trees. Some people think cemeteries are sad. Military cemeteries always felt different to me. They carried grief. But they also carried gratitude. As the sun began setting, Jack found me walking back toward the visitor center. "I figured I'd find you here." "I needed to say hello." He nodded. "So did I." We walked together in comfortable silence. Finally, he asked, "Have you talked to your father?" "No." "Has he called?" "No." Jack looked toward the rows of headstones stretching across the hillside. "You know, I've met a lot of stubborn men. I've served with some. I've commanded some." He smiled. "Your father might be the most stubborn." I laughed despite myself. "That sounds about right. But people surprise you. I've seen it." I wasn't so sure. Dad had spent decades believing women couldn't lead soldiers. One remarkable afternoon at a shooting range couldn't erase an entire lifetime. Or could it? Back in Kentucky, things weren't as quiet as I imagined. Mom called the next morning. "Your father hasn't been himself." "What do you mean?" "He's asking questions." "About what?" "About you." That caught me completely off guard. "He asked me where your Ranger School graduation pictures were. He wanted to know when you earned your Bronze Star. He even asked if I'd kept the newspaper articles." I sat down slowly on the hotel bed. "In 30 years." Mom's voice trembled. I've never seen him ask. Meanwhile, Dad was doing something he hadn't done in years. He was opening boxes in the attic, boxes Mom had carefully labeled but that he'd ignored for over a decade. Inside were newspaper clippings, promotion programs, military newsletters, holiday cards, letters, dozens of letters, everyone addressed in my handwriting. Most had never been opened. Mom had saved every single one. Dad sat alone beneath the attic light reading words I'd written years earlier. Letters describing my first duty station, Christmas cards mailed from overseas, birthday wishes, simple notes ending with the same sentence every time. Love, Emily. Not anger, not resentment. Love. For the first time, my father realized something painful. I had never stopped trying to be his daughter. He had simply stopped trying to be my father. That realization would soon change everything. When I returned to Fort Campbell, life immediately settled back into its familiar rhythm. The Army has a way of reminding you that personal problems don't stop the mission. By 6 every morning, I was already reviewing training schedules. Meetings filled the afternoons, reports filled the evenings. On paper, everything looked normal. Inside, nothing felt normal anymore. Every night before going to bed, I found myself wondering whether my father had looked at that old photograph again, whether he still believed Captain Jack Morrison had somehow mistaken me for someone else, or whether for the first time in his life doubt had finally found its way into his certainty. I didn't call, not because I hated him, because I had spent 20 years being the one who reached first. I was simply tired. About a week after the conference, my mother called. Her voice sounded different, not sad, hopeful. Emily, what is it? I think your father is changing. I smiled politely even though she couldn't see it. You've said that before. I know. But this time is different. She told me he had stopped watching television after dinner. Instead, every evening he disappeared into the attic carrying another dusty box downstairs. Boxes that hadn't been opened in years. Boxes filled with memories. Mom described him sitting quietly at the kitchen table wearing reading glasses, carefully sorting through photographs. Sometimes he smiled. Sometimes he simply stared. Sometimes she caught him wiping away tears when he thought she wasn't looking. That image didn't fit the father I had known. Frank Carter didn't cry. Not when his own father died. Not when he retired after nearly 3 decades as a police officer. Not even when I left home for officer candidate school. Yet somehow a handful of old letters had accomplished what nothing else could. 2 days later, another phone call came. This time it wasn't my mother. Major Carter. The voice sounded familiar. Speaking. This is Tom Henderson. I immediately smiled. Tom had served beside my father in the Army National Guard decades earlier, before becoming a high school history teacher. He'd practically lived at our house when I was growing up. I haven't heard your voice in years. I know. I'm actually sitting in your parents' living room. That surprised me. Everything okay? There was a long pause. I think your father finally understands. Tom spoke gently, choosing each word with care. He asked me something today. What? He asked whether I remembered you as a little girl. I laughed softly. I hope you said I wasn't too much trouble. Oh, you were plenty of trouble. We both chuckled. Then his tone became serious again. I told him something he'd forgotten. What was that? The day you were 11. At first I couldn't place the memory. Then it came rushing back. Our county fair had hosted a youth marksmanship competition. Jason had entered. So had I. Dad spent weeks helping Jason practice. He never offered to help me. I practiced by myself with an old pellet rifle Grandpa had given me before he passed away. The day of the competition, I'd quietly won my age division. Dad congratulated Jason for finishing 3rd. He never noticed my trophy, Tom remembered. I asked your father if he knew where your first shooting trophy ended up. I honestly don't. I do. It was sitting in a cardboard box upstairs. Silence settled between us. Tom continued. Frank held that little trophy for almost 10 minutes. He kept saying. Tom stopped. What? How could I not remember this? My chest tightened. There wasn't an answer. Some memories disappear because time passes. Others disappear because we never allow ourselves to see them in the first place. Tom cleared his throat. There's something else. I'm listening. He found your letters. I closed my eyes. Every deployment. Every birthday. Every Christmas. Every promotion. I'd written. Not because I expected long replies, just because I hoped one day he'd read them. He opened every single one. My voice barely escaped. Everyone. Even the oldest. Tom described finding my father alone at the kitchen table. One envelope after another. Some still carried military postmarks from Iraq, others from Afghanistan. One had been mailed during my first assignment at Fort Benning. Dad read them all. He didn't rush. He studied every page, every sentence, every photograph I'd tucked inside. There was one letter in particular Tom wanted to tell me about. It had been written shortly after Ranger School. I could barely remember writing it. Apparently, I had ended it this way. Dad, I know you probably don't understand why I chose this life. I just hope that someday you'll believe I chose it because I wanted to serve my country, not because I wanted to disappoint you. I still hope you'll be proud of me one day. Tom's voice cracked slightly. Frank couldn't finish reading it. I swallowed hard. For years, I had imagined my father ignoring those letters because he didn't care. The truth turned out to be more complicated. He had never opened many of them. Pride had become a wall. Every unopened envelope made the next one harder to read. Until 20 years had passed. Tom sighed. Emily, your father said something I never thought I'd hear. What? He said. Tom paused. I spent my whole life trying to make my daughter tougher. I never realized she spent her whole life trying to make me proud. I couldn't speak. Some wounds don't bleed. They simply stay quiet for years. Then one sentence opens all of them at once. The following Saturday, something happened that surprised our entire hometown. Dad drove to the county veterans' breakfast. Normally, he sat with retired police officers discussing fishing, college basketball, and politics. This time, he stood before everyone and quietly asked if he could say a few words. According to Mom, you could have heard a pin drop. Frank Carter wasn't known for public apologies. He wasn't known for admitting mistakes. He took a deep breath. I've spent most of my life believing I understood courage. He looked around the room. I was wrong. The veterans listened without interrupting. I thought courage looked like a badge, or a uniform, or winning a fight. He shook his head. My daughter taught me something. Real courage is continuing to love someone, even after they've given you every reason to stop. Several older veterans lowered their eyes. One quietly nodded. Dad wasn't asking for sympathy. He was confessing regret. After breakfast, he did something else nobody expected. He walked into the local post office. He purchased a plain white envelope. Inside, he placed every unopened letter I'd ever mailed him, along with a single handwritten note. He addressed the package to me. When it arrived 3 days later, I recognized his handwriting immediately. I carried it into my living room but couldn't bring myself to open it. Not yet. Some moments deserve your full attention. And somehow, I already knew my life was about to change again. The package sat unopened on my kitchen table for almost 2 days. I walked past it every morning before work. Every evening I looked at it again. The familiar handwriting on the front stopped me every time. Major Emily Carter. For the first time in my life, my father hadn't written simply Emily. He had written my rank. Some people might have overlooked that detail. I couldn't. It was the first acknowledgement he'd ever given my career. On Friday evening, I finally made myself a cup of coffee, sat down, and carefully opened the envelope. Inside were every letter I had ever mailed him. Each one had been placed in chronological order. On top rested a single sheet of yellow legal paper. Dad had always written on legal pads. The note was only 1 page long. Emily, I've spent 2 days reading words I should have read years ago. I don't deserve your forgiveness. I don't even deserve another chance to ask for it. I thought I was raising you to be strong. Instead, you became stronger despite me. I kept waiting for you to become someone I could understand. I never stopped to understand the person you already were. I've been proud of a badge I wore for 28 years. I should have been proud of the daughter who wore her uniform with honor. If you're willing, I'd like to start over. Love. Dad. I read the letter 3 times. Then I folded it carefully and placed it back into the envelope. For years, I had imagined what an apology from my father might sound like. Somehow, reality hurt more than fantasy ever had. Not because his words weren't sincere. Because they came wrapped inside 20 years we could never get back. The following Monday, Captain Jack Morrison called. I've got good news. I could use some. You've been selected. For what? The Distinguished Service Leadership Award. I sighed. Jack, I know how you feel about ceremonies. You hate them. I really do. Too bad. He laughed. You'll receive it during the Veterans Day celebration in Arlington. I wasn't expecting that. Neither were you expecting to become everyone's favorite speaker. I still don't think they invited the right person. They absolutely did. Veterans Day had always meant something special to me. Not because of parades, not because of speeches, Because it was one day each year when Americans paused long enough to remember that freedom always had a human cost. The ceremony would be held at Fort Myer just outside Arlington National Cemetery. Senior military leaders would attend. Gold Star families, veterans from every generation, students from local schools, community volunteers. It wasn't about celebrating one person. It was about recognizing lives dedicated to service. When I arrived in Virginia the week before Veterans Day, the autumn leaves had turned brilliant shades of red and gold. The air carried that unmistakable November chill. Jack met me outside the conference center. "You nervous?" "I've jumped out of helicopters." "I'm asking about the speech." I smiled. "A little?" "You'll do fine." "What if I don't?" "Then you'll still do better than half the politicians I've heard." That earned him a laugh. The evening before the ceremony, organizers hosted a dinner for recipients and military families. I spent most of the night talking with older veterans. A Korean War veteran named Harold told me about surviving the Chosun Reservoir. An 83-year-old Army nurse described treating wounded soldiers during Vietnam. A retired Coast Guard rescue pilot shared stories about hurricanes along the Gulf Coast. Listening to them reminded me why I loved these gatherings. Everyone had a story. Nobody believed theirs mattered more than anyone else's. Late that night I called Mom. "How are things?" There was a brief silence. "Your father's gone." My heart skipped. "What?" She laughed softly. "Not like that. He left this afternoon." "Left where?" "I think..." She hesitated. "I think he's driving to Virginia." I sat upright. "He didn't tell you..." "No. He only packed one suitcase. He said there was somewhere he needed to be." After we hung up, I stared out the hotel window toward the lights of Washington. Part of me wondered if Mom had guessed wrong. Dad hated long drives. He especially disliked driving around Northern Virginia traffic. Surely he wouldn't make a 9-hour trip alone. Would he? Veterans Day dawned crisp and bright. American flags lined the roads leading toward Fort Myer. School bands rehearsed quietly. Families gathered along the walkways. Wheelchairs rolled beside young soldiers in dress uniforms. Children carried small flags while older veterans wore caps embroidered with names of ships' divisions and distant battlefields. Standing backstage, I adjusted my Army service uniform one last time. Jack walked over. "You ready?" "As ready as I'll ever be." A military band began playing America the Beautiful. The audience rose. Thousands of people stood together. Some placed hands over their hearts. Others saluted. Looking across that crowd, I realized how many different generations of service stood together that morning. World War II families, Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan. Different uniforms, one country. The ceremony began with the presentation of colors. Then came speeches from local leaders. Finally, the master of ceremonies introduced the award recipients. When they called my name, I walked onto the stage feeling oddly calm. The citation described leadership, integrity, service before self. I accepted the medal with a simple handshake. Then came the speech. I stepped to the podium and looked across the audience. Rows upon rows of faces waited quietly. "I've been asked many times what leadership means," I began. "I've learned it isn't about being the strongest person in the room. It isn't about rank. It isn't about medals. It's about making sure the people beside you get home." The crowd remained completely still. I've worn this uniform for many years. The greatest honor of my life has never been receiving promotions. It's been serving alongside ordinary Americans who did extraordinary things when their country asked. I spoke about teamwork, sacrifice, responsibility, and finally forgiveness. "Some battles follow us home," I said softly. "They aren't fought with weapons. They're fought with pride, with misunderstanding, with words we wish we'd never spoken." I've learned that forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It gives the future a chance. As I finished, applause spread through the crowd. People slowly rose to their feet, another standing ovation. I lowered my head overwhelmed. Then, as I looked toward the back rows, I saw him, standing alone, wearing his old police dress jacket with a small American flag pinned to the lapel. My father. He had driven nearly 9 hours by himself, and for the first time in my entire life, he was applauding me. The applause echoed across the parade field long after I stepped away from the podium. I wasn't looking at the medal resting against my uniform. I wasn't thinking about the speech. I couldn't take my eyes off my father. Frank Carter stood near the back of the audience with both hands clasped in front of him. The same man who had once refused to attend my commissioning ceremony had driven hundreds of miles just to watch me receive an award he never imagined I'd earn. For a brief moment, neither of us moved. People surrounded me, offering congratulations, asking for photographs, shaking my hand. I smiled politely, but my attention kept drifting toward him. He didn't try to push through the crowd. He simply waited. That alone told me something had changed. The father I grew up with would have demanded attention. This man seemed content to stand quietly until everyone else had gone. Captain Jack Morrison leaned close. I think someone's been rehearsing this conversation for 9 hours. I managed a small smile. I think you're right. You don't have to rush. I know. Jack placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. Take your time. Nearly 40 minutes passed before the crowd finally began to thin. Families headed toward the parking lots. Veterans gathered in small circles to exchange stories. The military band packed away their instruments. Only then did my father slowly walk toward me. He looked older than he had only a few weeks earlier. Not physically, emotionally, as though the weight he'd been carrying had finally become visible. He stopped several feet away. Neither of us spoke. For most of my life, silence between us had felt uncomfortable. This silence felt different. It felt honest. Finally, he cleared his throat. You looked proud up there. I smiled gently. I was proud of the people I served with. He nodded. I noticed. Another silence. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I wrote down what I wanted to say. He looked embarrassed. I was afraid I'd lose my nerve. You don't have to read it. I think I do. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the paper. I spent the whole drive thinking about where I went wrong. His voice was quiet. When you were little, I convinced myself I was protecting you. I thought the world would hurt you. So I tried to steer you toward what I believed was a safer life. He paused. What I actually did was teach you that your own father didn't believe in you. The words settled heavily between us. I told myself I was old-fashioned. I told myself it was just the way I was raised. He shook his head slowly. Those were excuses. I wasn't protecting my daughter. I was protecting my own pride. I listened without interrupting. For years I had imagined confronting him, listing every missed birthday, every ignored promotion, every cruel remark. Now that the moment had arrived, I found I didn't want to argue anymore. He lowered the paper. When Captain Morrison saluted you, I realized something. I'd spent 20 years looking at your uniform. I never looked at the woman wearing it. My eyes filled with tears despite my best efforts. He continued. I missed your commissioning. I missed Ranger School. I missed promotions. I missed holidays. I even missed getting to know my own daughter. He looked directly at me. I'm so sorry, Emily. I'm sorry for every year I wasted. The apology I had dreamed about for decades had finally arrived. And yet forgiveness wasn't as simple as saying it's okay. Because it wasn't okay. Those years were gone forever. I appreciate you saying that, I answered honestly. He nodded. I know it doesn't fix anything. No, it doesn't. He accepted that without argument. I don't expect you to forgive me today. I don't even know if I deserve it. I just needed you to know that I finally understand. Captain Jack quietly walked past us, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. Without saying a word, he handed one to each of us. Then he started walking away again. My father called after him. Captain! Jack turned. I owe you a thank you. Jack smiled. No. You owe your daughter one. I've been trying. Jack nodded. I know. Then he added something I'll never forget. You know what I've learned after 30 years in the military. Dad shook his head. The strongest soldiers aren't the ones who never make mistakes. They're the ones willing to admit them before it's too late. With that, Jack quietly left us alone. Dad stared down at his coffee. I've been thinking. About what? I've spent years talking about supporting veterans. He gave a humorless laugh. I wasn't even supporting the veteran in my own family. I didn't know what to say. So, he continued, I've already signed up. For what? The VA hospital back home. They need volunteers to drive older veterans to appointments. I looked at him. I start next Tuesday. That surprised me. There's more. He smiled sheepishly. The VFW post asked if I'd help with their mentoring program. They've got younger police officers and veterans adjusting to civilian life. I figured. He hesitated. Maybe it's time I started listening instead of talking. For the first time that afternoon, I laughed. That would certainly surprise the people back home. It already has. We walked slowly toward Arlington National Cemetery. Neither of us felt any need to hurry. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the white headstones. We stopped overlooking the rows of graves. Dad removed his cap. I've been thinking about those letters. So have I. I don't know why I couldn't open them. I think I do now. I looked at him. Every time one arrived, it reminded me that you were becoming someone I didn't understand. So I avoided it. I thought ignoring the letters would somehow stop time. It didn't. His honesty hurt. But it also healed. For the first time, we weren't pretending. We were telling the truth. He looked at me. I can't be the father I should have been 20 years ago. No, I can't. But, he swallowed hard. If you'll let me, I'd like to try being a better father tomorrow. I took a long breath. Forgiveness isn't a switch. It's a choice. Sometimes it's a choice you have to make again and again. I can't promise everything will be easy. I'm not asking for easy. I can't erase the past. I wouldn't ask you to. I stepped forward, slowly, carefully. Then I hugged my father. For a few seconds he stood completely still. Then his arms wrapped around me. Neither of us spoke. We didn't have to. Some conversations happen without words. As we walked back toward the parking lot, Dad smiled for the first time all day. I almost forgot. What? He reached into his pocket and handed me another envelope. Open it later. What's inside? He grinned. An invitation. To what? Our town's Veterans Day dinner next month. He looked almost nervous. They've asked me to introduce the guest speaker. I raised an eyebrow. And who would that be? He smiled. My daughter. The invitation stayed on my refrigerator door for nearly 3 weeks. It wasn't fancy. Just a simple cream-colored card from the Bowling Green Veterans of Foreign Wars Post. Annual Veterans Day Community Dinner. Guest speaker Major Emily Carter. Introduced by Frank Carter. I smiled every time I walked past it. Not because my name appeared on the card. Because my father's did. If someone had shown me that invitation a month earlier, I would have laughed. Frank Carter introducing his daughter with pride. It would have sounded like fiction. Life has a strange way of proving us wrong. The drive home to Kentucky felt different this time. For years, returning home had filled me with anxiety. I always wondered which version of my father would greet me. The disappointed one. The sarcastic one. The distant one. This time I wasn't afraid. When I pulled into my parents' driveway, Dad was already outside. Not standing on the porch with his arms crossed. Not pretending to stay busy in the garage. He was waiting. The moment I stepped out of my truck, he walked over and hugged me. No hesitation. No awkwardness. Just a father welcoming his daughter home. Mom stood on the porch, wiping away happy tears. I've waited a long time to see that, she whispered. So have I answered. That evening felt wonderfully ordinary. Dad grilled steaks in the backyard. Mom made mashed potatoes, green beans, and her famous apple pie. We talked about everyday things. My niece's softball games, Jason's new job, the church fundraiser, the weather. It may not sound remarkable, but after years of strained conversations, ordinary felt extraordinary. Later that night, Dad and I sat on the back porch watching the sun disappear behind the fields where I had grown up. I owe you another apology, he said quietly. I smiled. You've already apologized. I know. But this one's different. He looked out across the pasture. When you were little, do you remember asking me to teach you how to shoot? I laughed softly. I remember. I told you to go help your mother. You did. He sighed. I've replayed that moment 100 times. I wish I'd handed you the rifle. I wish I'd said yes. I wish I'd understood that encouraging my daughter didn't take anything away from my son. I rested my elbows on the porch railing. You know something? What? Grandpa taught me anyway. He looked surprised. I never told you. He shook his head. I smiled. The old pellet rifle wasn't really for squirrels. It was for me. He said every child deserved someone who believed in them. Dad closed his eyes. I should have been that person. You can be now. He looked at me. You really believe that I wouldn't be sitting here if I didn't? Veterans Day dinner arrived the following evening. The VFW hall looked exactly the way I remembered from childhood. American flags lined the walls. Photographs of local service members stretched back nearly 80 years. Old friends embraced one another. Children ran between folding tables while volunteers poured coffee into white paper cups. Most of the veterans were well into their 70s and 80s. Some walked slowly with canes. Others wore hats embroidered with names like USS Midway 1st Cavalry Division 101st Airborne and Vietnam Veteran. Every one of them carried a lifetime of stories. Before dinner, Dad disappeared into a small office behind the stage. When he came back out, he looked more nervous than I'd ever seen him. "You okay?" I asked. He laughed. "I've testified in court. I've arrested armed suspects. I've spoken at police graduations. This is somehow scarier." "You'll do fine." "I hope so." The room gradually quieted. The commander of the VFW welcomed everyone. After the opening prayer and the Pledge of Allegiance, he stepped to the microphone. And now he said, "I'd like to invite Frank Carter to introduce tonight's guest speaker." Dad slowly walked onto the stage. He unfolded a single sheet of paper. Then he looked up. "I've spent most of my life believing fathers were supposed to teach their children." He paused. "I was wrong. Sometimes, children end up teaching their parents." The room grew completely silent. My daughter spent 20 years serving this country. I spent far too many of those years believing she had chosen the wrong path. He swallowed. I told myself I was protecting her. The truth is, I was protecting my own stubbornness. Several older veterans nodded quietly. I missed promotions. I missed ceremonies. I missed opportunities I'll never get back. He looked toward me, but my daughter gave me something I never deserved. A second chance. His voice trembled. I used to think courage belonged only to men carrying rifles. Now I know courage also belongs to daughters who keep loving their fathers even when those fathers don't make it easy. I felt tears forming again. Dad smiled. "There are many decorated soldiers in America. But tonight, I'm introducing the one I'm proud to call my daughter. Ladies and gentlemen, Major Emily Carter." The applause began before I reached the stage. It wasn't loud because of my military career. It was loud because everyone in that room understood exactly how difficult forgiveness can be. I stood beside my father for a moment before stepping to the microphone. Instead of beginning my speech, I turned toward him. "You spent years teaching me something," I said. He looked confused. "I did. You taught me that character matters. You taught me to keep my word. You taught me to work hard. Those lessons helped make me the officer I became." He shook his head. "I almost buried those lessons under my own pride." "Maybe. But they're still true." I faced the audience. "If there's one thing I've learned through military service, it's this. None of us gets everything right. We all make mistakes. We all carry regrets. The question isn't whether we'll fail. It's whether we'll have the courage to admit it before we run out of time." The room remained perfectly still. I used to think revenge meant proving someone wrong. I glanced toward my father. I don't believe that anymore. Real victory isn't watching someone else fall. It's watching someone choose to become better. And sometimes, the greatest battle any of us will ever fight isn't overseas. It's inside our own hearts. When I finished, the applause seemed to last forever. As people began leaving the hall, dozens stopped to speak with Dad. Not about me. About themselves. One Vietnam veteran admitted he hadn't spoken to his own son in 12 years. A retired firefighter quietly said he needed to call his daughter. A Korean war widow thanked Dad for reminding her that pride can steal precious years. It struck me then that our story no longer belonged only to us. It belonged to every family carrying old wounds they still had time to heal. Outside, beneath the cool Kentucky night sky, Dad and I stood beside my truck. Without saying a word, he slowly raised his right hand. It wasn't a perfect military salute. Years as a police officer had made it slightly different. I smiled anyway. Then I returned it. It wasn't about military tradition. It was about mutual respect. The respect we'd both been searching for all those years. As I drove away, I glanced once in the rearview mirror. Mom stood beside Dad, her hand wrapped around his. Both of them were smiling. For the first time since I was a little girl, home looked exactly the way I'd always hoped it would. If this story reminded you of someone you've been meaning to call forgive or simply thank, don't wait. Pride has a way of stealing time, and time is the one thing none of us can earn back. If this journey touched your heart, please consider sharing it with someone who might need the reminder that reconciliation is still possible. And if you'd like to hear more stories about family, courage, redemption, and second chances, I'd be honored if you subscribed and joined me again.